Item number 4, House Bill 475. The reason that we've all been getting the emails. Representative Carter, you are recognized.
My apologies for that. Bill.
Not at all. Not at all. We have a motion. We have a second. We have an amendment on the bill, drafting code 004269. Do we have a motion on the amendment? Motion. Let's be clear, it's 4267. Let's
Yes,
make sure that we are correct on that. 4267. Do we have a motion on amendment with the drafting code 4267? Motion. Second. You are now recognized on your amendment.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, thank you very much. This bill allows people living in the unincorporated area to have a say over the annexation confronting them by referendum. It does not affect consensual takings by the city.
All right. Discussion on the amendment. See, Representative Stewart on the amendment.
What's the change in the amendment?
Yeah, I inadvertently during the drafting said that if you were wanted to come into the city, they still had to have a referendum, and I just didn't catch it until a week before, and I had that amended. I didn't mean that. I don't know how I missed it when I drafted it.
Thank you.
Further discussion on the amendment. Seeing Representative Holt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, sponsor. What would be the threshold for consensual? I mean, if it was a neighborhood or an industrial area, how would you go about defining consensual, if you could surmise that?
It must be at least 51%.
Okay.
So it'd be the same as the referendum, in other words.
But it would be done prior to the annexation or
Yes.
as a volunteer?
Yes.
Thank you.
Further discussion on the amendment. Seeing none, we're ready to vote. All in favor of the amendment, say aye. Aye. All opposed? The amendment goes on. We're back on the bill as amended. Discussion on the bill as amended. Representative Chairman Dean, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the sponsor yielding. I have a question.
All right.
Let's suppose that I own a piece of property that's located here, and the city limits are located here. There is property between me and the city limits. I've invested in this property because I'm in the urban growth boundary, and I have anticipated being annexed into the city. The voters between me and the city limits can override the urban growth boundary plan and keep me from being annexed into the city. Is that correct?
Yes, unless you talk to the city and go in by consent. One person can go in by consent. It's not necessary.
Even though they're not contiguous to the city limits?
They must be contiguous in some way. They must touch under the currently existing law. There's all kind of discussions about amending that, but that's not before us today.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Further discussion on the amendment. We adopted the amendment. I apologize. We are on the bill as amended. Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Once again, to sponsor, how will this affect, in layman's terms, the ability for cities to grow?
If it is by consent, then it's not affected by this bill. If it is not by consent, if the area is not brought in by its own petition, then the city must obtain a referendum with 51% of those people approving in order for the city to grow into that area. It gives that person a right for the first time in Tennessee to say something about their future. It gives them the right to vote.
And in doing this, will this have an effect on the city's abilities to recruit businesses to the cities and things of that nature?
I have heard that argument around the halls, and I'm absolutely devoid to understand that at all. No, it will not.
Okay. Mr. Chair, do you mind if we go out of recess to hear from TML or someone?
Without objection. Any objection? Seeing none, we'll go into recess. We'll hear from TML. You're recognized.
Mr. Chairman. Chad Jenkins, Tennessee Municipal League. With your indulgence, Mr. Chairman, if I get, just cut me off, but when this law, the current law, was created, there there was a period in which we had very aggressive annexation policy in the state. There were a number of lawsuits, an increasing number of lawsuits. Cities and counties were fighting each other constantly, and the General Assembly was having to deal with these battles weekly with competing bills. So the decision was made, look, we're going to round all the people up. Cities and counties, we're putting you in a room, and we're going to work this out. And at the end of the day, we're going to come out with a new comprehensive that addresses all these issues. And we're going to accomplish certain objectives. We're going to restrict the unregulated growth. We're going to stop the sprawl. We're going to rein in annexations. We're going to prevent these spot annexations and quarters annexations. We're going to make sure that city limits are not meandering and incongruous. And we're going to address the gaps in the public safety coverage and in services. So that was the intent of what they're to do. At the end of it, that process was successful in accomplishing those objectives. As part of that, admittedly, counties hated that decision as equally as cities hated it, and that's kind of the nature of anything. So yes, we all have complaints about the current law. However, the decision was also made at the time in the agreement, which is held until today, that was not to be disturbed. It was to be a 20-year. As a part of that, we were going to all agree, cities and counties, within each county, we're going to agree where the lines were going to be, and we were going to establish those lines. If you were within the city, that was called an urban growth boundary. And for the next 20 years, the cities and other cities and counties had agreed that your limits could extend up to that point. And accordingly and appropriately, cities were given the authority to annex within that period. And so it was generally understood and accepted that that would be the 20-year limits of a city, that they couldn't go beyond that. Again, that was agreed upon between the cities and the counties, ratified by the governing bodies of each, and therefore representative of those elected leaders and the folks that they represented, everybody in the county and everyone in the city appropriately. Again, that law was successful. In our opinion, if this bill were to pass, obviously it would signal an end to that agreement that's held to this date. It would fundamentally alter that agreement and the urban growth boundary and the authority that cities have regarding that. There would no longer be the clarity that we have regarding the lines and authority within those lines. And I believe, just finally, that it would result in us returning to many of those same conditions which the General Assembly stopped. And I'll give you a couple examples. The whole idea, again, was to stop sprawl and promote reasonable and responsible growth. Well, that is best accomplished through having the ability to plan ahead of time, to get your infrastructure in place, get sure your public safety aspects are taken care of, get zoning, get planning, get your utilities, streets, and the thing, to prepare for that. It's best and most efficient and least costly to do that in advance of growth, not to wait till after it occurs. That was the intent of the law when it was enacted, and it's actually afforded that opportunity. If this were to pass, that opportunity would be lost. Another objective was to eliminate the donut holes and the quarter annexations. I think Representative Dean asked a question which kind of gets to this aspect of it. If you assume everybody is contiguous that wants to be in a city, then everybody's taken care of through this. But if you consider the possibility, the very real possibility, that there's someone with property that's currently today could be annexed within an urban growth area, and they have plans for that property, they would be precluded from being annexed, even if they were willing to be, because the adjacent property owners would not want to. There's no way to get to them, in other words. They're landlocked. Or we could meander a narrow, thin strip, but that was a practice that we sought to prohibit in the first place when we enacted the law. So that's illegal. So you couldn't get to them. Effectively, what you have is you have my property rights as the individual who wants to be annexed beyond others who are unwilling to be annexed. So now my property rights and my ability to exercise those rights are subject to another individual's property rights. So it's not equal property rights for all. We also have utilities, and cities made investments in those utilities with taxpayer funds with the understanding we're preparing for growth, we're putting it in now, We're making plans for infrastructure. Well, now if this happens, those utilities are likely going to be stranded outside of city limits and may no longer be in a place that makes any sense. They did at the time when we had the authority. If you remove it, then that changes the dynamic. Let me just conclude, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the committee's indulgence that it's been 13 years of a 20-year plan. It's appropriate to review that plan, and I think we agree. As I said, we got all of our complaints, and counties have theirs. Nobody has monopoly on complaints about it, but we've lived by it, and that's what we've been honored, and this would change it. If we're going to change it, it should be the result of the same deliberative process that created the current law, and where it's dealt with comprehensively and not piecemeal. So that would be our request, and that's our views.
A couple of things, and then we'll go to some others that have questions. You mentioned that in your opinion, that if this bill passes, it's the death of 1101 and the smart growth legislation. I'm just curious how you arrive at that when we had the executive director of TASER before this committee several weeks ago, and she testified that the 1101 law had been changed over the last 13 years like 20-some-odd times, and it's still by the legislature, so it's still operating and going. Could you help me understand why this is, in your opinion, the thing that's just going to...
Right, and Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, those are your words, not mine. But essentially,
no, you said
the death. I didn't use the death. But the point, and I'm sorry, that's irrelevant. But
Representative Faison, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to remind the committee of something. It's interesting. He's saying they agreed on a 20-year plan 13 years ago. But I challenge any of y'all who've been for any amount of time. Do we ever pass a law that ties the hands of future legislators? We don't do that. And that is a very extremely dangerous practice. And 13 years ago, I wasn't at the table, neither were the 65,000 people that I represent. So it's a very good thing that just because you make an agreement doesn't mean it stays. This is America. We're a representative form of government, and we can change with each new General Assembly that comes. So that's my thought on that. Just want to remind the committee that we don't tie hands of future legislators. And the other thing, the concern that you brought up about the people who might want to be annexed, I feel like they have as much right and ability to get out and lobby their neighbors and their friends to vote for this referendum as the people who don't want to be annexed. This is the beauty of a piece of legislation like this, that you're letting the people decide. And if you want to be annexed, you can get out, use your time, your energy, your resources, and make sure your neighbors are with you, or either they're going to beat you, one of the two. But at the end of the day, and I can attest, as many of y'all have seen in your emails over this weekend, the people's voice will be heard on the referendum. So I applaud this legislation, and I think it's a good thing.
Representative Carr, Chairman Carr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jenkins, I got a quick question. It has come to my attention that Tennessee is one of only 3 states left in the country that don't allow for property owners to have a direct voice in the annexation of their property. Are you aware of that?
No, sir, I'm not. I'm not just.
My understanding, there are 2 other states. One of them is North Carolina, and the other is Indiana. And both those states are seeking to address that concern this year. I think it would be a shame if we didn't give property owners a direct voice in the annexation of their property. And honestly, it reminds me of annexation without direct representation. And as I've carried bills dealing with eminent domain and annexation for 4 years up here, and I think it's a relevant and very important point, being that when our founding fathers determined life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, when Thomas Jefferson first penned that, it was life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. And property is a fundamental element in that pursuit of happiness. And when government, through whatever means necessary, takes that property, it borders on tyranny. And I think we need to be very, very careful. And all we're saying, and all this bill does, as Representative Carter's doing, is saying the people whose property is going to be annexed deserve to have a direct voice. I appreciate you coming today, but I think it's relevant, and for that purpose, I'll be supporting the bill. Thank you.
Any questions for Mr. Jenkins? All right, Representative Parkinson.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I appreciate you allowing us to hear both sides of this. But you spoke about the ability for cities to plan in response to proposed annexation, and under this legislation, will that change to where they'll have to be in more of a respond mode once an annexation happens to get the services and those items that are needed in the annexed area to the annexed area?
Yes, sir. Thanks for the question. One of the benefits of the current law and what was intended was to allow for responsible growth and intentional planned growth. That has been accomplished, and that's accomplished now. Because now, with the exclusive authority, we know where the territory is. We can anticipate growth and get ahead of it. You get your utilities put in the ground, you get the roads and streets, and you plan for all that. That takes some time and lead time. You can anticipate that coming. So you can go ahead and move towards that in advance. That allows you to control, to be ahead of pace. If you lose that ability, which you would in this case, if this bill passes, then you are solely being reactive, and growth will no longer be planned and intentional. It will be reactive and be determined really by the unwilling property owners. Those unwilling to come in the city will dictate where the city limits now have to go, and that would be the difference in responses. So the short answer to your question is absolutely. That's correct.
Okay, and one last question, Mr. Chair. Has there been, will this have any effect on, I know some of you aren't going to like this question, but I'm asking anyway, will there be any effect on the amount of federal dollars that a city may receive due to the outcome of this legislation if this legislation is passed? Is there a possibility?
It's a possibility. I'm not. Well, there are some with water and sewer requirements. Some of those programs could affect federal funding, your eligibility, because we are required to meet certain requirements there. I can't give you specifics. That nothing comes to. If I think about it, maybe a while, but that's all the best I can answer right now.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could you tell me if I'm a resident of the county, not in the city, and the city wants to annex my property right now today, who in the city represents me?
No one, sir.
So I would be getting additional taxes put on me without any representation.
I would respond to that saying that at the time when the authority was established in the state law, and when all those lines were drawn, both the cities and the counties, when that was done, it was done by the governing bodies. So that individual was represented at that negotiating table and as part of those discussions by the county governing body, as were the city residents. So they were agreed to, not by, the city didn't impose these, the General Assembly didn't impose these. The city government and the county government all had to agree and then ratify them by a proper vote, which is the way things are often done.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Further questions for Mr. Jenkins? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Jenkins. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you, sir.
Without objection, we are back in session. We're on the bill, House Bill 475, as amended. Further discussion? Seeing none, we're ready to vote. All in favor of House Bill 475 going to Finance, say aye. Aye. All opposed? No. The ayes have it. Bill goes to Finance.